Thank you, and thanks to the whole UQ team for making this whole day happen. It's really wonderful to be able to host people in these kind of conditions. So yeah, thank you so much. Today we're going to talk about how concepts of conservation that involve science and policy efforts turn up in a really particular place, the Cassady Coast in North Queensland. But also speak to a lot of the issues that came up this morning, broader trends in ecosystem protection and climate, where climate is not just an ecosystem challenge, but a shared social challenge in which race figures so violently and prominently still today. In the context of making this film, I did go to a lot of coral conferences as research, but no amount of high-resolution close-ups of coral can teach us about what has and will be endured as the reef, loses its own culture. And I think these people have a lot to teach us about how we deal with that onshore. So thank you so much for being here. Thanks, Coen, who's going to bring the Indigenous science perspective to this conversation. For the people in the room who haven't actually seen the film was an invitation to me to make a work around this archive of a successful political campaign that saved the entire Great Barrier Reef from oil drilling. So under the Bjelke-Petersen government in the 60s, the entire length of the Great Barrier Reef was actually covered in oil drilling licenses. And it was a very small group of people who generated this wholly national, the first national kind of settler environment campaign, which successfully, after something like 6,000 letters to politicians and other important people around the world, eventually shut that down and got the reef protected in 1975. The campaign was won only with the participation of trade unions in a national strike, and that strike sometimes gets left out of the conservation story when the story is told. And it was a strike that wouldn't be legally possible today, so trade unions don't have the same power now as they did then. When I was invited to make the film, I was interested also in the loss of that story, that history. Because I think that is a story about organised solidarity and tactical solidarity. What was remarkable about that moment is that the federal conservation efforts went wholly against the interests of the Queensland government at that time, and there was very little marine science being conducted in Queensland to rely on decision-making about the reef. So the whole argument for actually saving the reef for the settler parliamentarians in apartheid conditions in Queensland at that time was that ignorance was a problem. So they didn't actually know enough about the reef to be confident about destroying parts of it for an oil industry. And what the artists, the interesting thing about what the artists contributed who were running the campaign is they could imagine more than what the pragmatic politicians were thinking of at the time. So no one was really thinking about, what if we saved all of the reef? It was an artist who was like, what if we called the whole thing a single organism and saved all of it? Whereas the politicians were thinking, maybe we can take bits of it and parts of it and destroy parts of it, and then we can just carry on as business as usual. So anyway, that's the history if you haven't seen the film. Importantly, when all of that offshore territory was saved from an industry, Australia was expanding fossil fuel production. 98% of the land was not protected from development. No Indigenous land rights were recognised, and even after Mabo, environment legislation continues with terra nullius ideas. The wet tropics was protected after that, and there was no Indigenous input into the wet tropics legislation either. The Cassady Coast is south of the Daintree, so it's still much less protected than the much of the wet tropics. And maybe I thought, as by way of introducing Sonya and Jacob, the you guys are also connected by the organisation called Girrigan, which the audience won't necessarily know much about, but the founding of Girrigan is very much about this refusal of a national park and the refusal of the lack of Indigenous control over national parks in Queensland. I wondered if that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I think if people know Carl Lomholtz, I think they named it after him, who really said some degrading things about Aboriginal people in our region. So Girrigan, if you look up on the map there, I was just looking at, so that takes in 9 nations, including mine, which is Nawagi, and we've got, I think we look after and manage National Park. There's a whole lot of IPAs, I think Mangala Station, and we've got a small one that are freehold country that are under Indigenous protected area. But we also do an amazing job on our sea country, in particular with the agreement with the Great Barrier Reef with the TUMRA. So for those that don't know, TUMRA is an acronym for Traditional Use of Marine Park Resource Agreement. But just getting back to Carl Lomholtz, it was called Lomholtz National Park, and we successfully, I don't know what year, we got it changed to Girrigan. 95 was it? 95 we got it changed to the Girrigan National Park. And so we're quite proud of the TUMRAs that we have, and I'll probably talk a bit about that later, but the thing is that what I'm involved with on Mangala Station is where we're a pretty big catchment area, so the water quality going out to our sea country is critical. Just to give you an example, in February we had a huge, massive flood. But my other connection to country is just off the coast. There's a group of islands called Palm Islands. If you don't know where that is, it's just not far from the coast there. But that's my grandmother's country, the Mumbra people. And over there, I was just talking yesterday at the radio station. We have these massive clams, big clam bag. There's nowhere else like it on the GBR. I think they were put there as an experiment but they're just massive. And I remember going over there as a young fella and swimming around. I was frightened of them because they were so big. I thought I'd get my leg caught and then I'd drown, so I was a bit wary of them. But after the floods in February, and this is how critical we talk about water, the impact of water going out on our sea country, with those clam beds, 100% mortality. They're gone. They're just gone. That's from the water coming off those. And we're involved with the wetlands. The wetlands play such a vital role in water quality going out to our sea country. And our wetlands, and just going a little bit back, we've had our property given back to us in the last 25 years. So we've had it for 25 years. And when we got our country back, we inherited all the bad farming practices. And there's a plant there they brought in as ponded pasture from South America called olive hibernacne. And it's just so aggressive. It just clogs up the waterways and clogs up the wetlands, and they just don't function. It's just like our body. And I tell this to kids, we do tourism as well, by the way, but we take people down on the wetlands and show them some of the stuff that we've been doing, trying to let the country breathe again. And it's just so impacted by these weeds. They're actually classified as WONS, W-O-N-S, weeds of national significance. So it's just full of these weeds, and it just doesn't function. So if the wetlands aren't functioning, the water quality getting out to the reef, so it's just every day we're down there, and every day my spirit gets I don't know what the word is, but just to see these waterways all clogged up and see what's happening and the changes, the changes of attitudes too. I'm probably getting off track here, but the changes of attitude, we forget that Great Barrier Reef, it's one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. And I think it's worth protecting. I think it's worth really coming back to changing attitudes. Look, we've got Ingham is a big sugarcane industry, and we all need the farming. We need agriculture. We do. But it should never come at the cost of the environment. It should never come. We've got to find the common sense, sensible balance, whether that requires us of thinking outside the box to make sure that we have our agriculture, but we got our environment kept for our children and their children. And I think that's something that I'm really passionate about. And hopefully that, because one of the things, look, to be honest, I'm sorry, Rachel, but I haven't seen the film. I haven't seen it. I've just been that busy. I've seen a little bits and pieces, but what I did see yesterday here was that initial battle to say Port Hinchinbrook. Yeah. And I didn't know that there was violent acts towards people protesting about, I didn't know that until I was seeing the film. But there were no blackfellas there. It was all non-Indigenous people standing and fighting for our country and putting their bodies on the line. And I think that we've got to start rallying again together to protect and change attitudes. And I use that word enshrinement. Enshrine the protection of our rainforest country, Bama, and enshrine the protection of our sea country, that Great Barrier Reef. There's nowhere else like it on the planet. And I think it's worth protecting. So, yeah, I better let Sonya talk. Get carried away.
So Rachel asks a question about Girrigan and how it all started. So our founding elders of Girrigan Aboriginal Corporation had a bit of a debate with the current government back then. They decided that what they were going to do was name the national parks surrounding a majority of the traditional owners after Carl Lumholt, a white Norwegian explorer that came out in the 1800s because he was looking for the tree kangaroo. And tree kangaroos are prevalent in Jacobs area and mine and up the top of where Atherton and Tablelands are. And basically he lived with Aboriginal people, camped with Aboriginal people in those particularly, especially Warragamay country and Jitterbug country up the top. And he wrote a book, Amongst Cannibals. And yes, it says a lot. And he wrote a lot of derogatory stuff about us as First Nations people. That was not true. And I have a copy of that book at home. My father used to use it a lot in a lot of his workshops. And the founding elders said, no way in the world are we going to allow a man like that to have the honour of being named on our country. So the founding elders got together, Girrigan Aboriginal Corporation started to form, and they went into battle. And they went into battle for 12 years. It took 12 years. They were even going to get David Attenborough to come out and launch it. And they pulled David Attenborough up too and said, no, not on our watch. It's not going to happen. So 12 years through the legal system, which is a common thing even in this contemporary world today that Aboriginal people still have to do to fight to have conservation rights and land rights and our cultural traditional rights at the very forefront when it comes to the natural environment. And really, we shouldn't have to. We shouldn't have to ask. We should be respected. That when it comes to nature, we should be the first point of contact, from any government department that wants to know information about country. So that's what happened there. 12 years down the track, they stopped it through court. The government said, we're not going to name it, and so they named it Girrigan, which is our creator that came from Palm Island, and he was half man, half eel, and he swam all the way up from Palm Island, and along the way he started creating everything. When he got to Cardwell, he came out onto the beach, and his eel part of him's turned into feet, and then he started walking all through country, creating the mountains, the birds, the animals, you name it. So that's our creation story for a lot of us mob up that way, and how what a beautiful fitting example that the creator Girrigan is now named, that national park is named after him.
Maybe just to continue from there, I was really fascinated by how much input is probably the right word you have into managing that whole IPA when it's not actually a lot of freehold Aboriginal property, right? Can you say something about the complications of that and how many ranges you have across that territory and what you're able to do and what you're not able to do across so many different kinds of land titles?
Yeah, so our Indigenous protected area at Girrigan Aboriginal Corporation is 1.2 million hectares. Incorporates national parks, private lands, what do they call them when they're unallocated state lands? And what's your establishment? Freehold, yeah. So, there's all these different land tenures that you have to deal with them. And with the land tenures comes all the legislation and red tape that you have to deal with. And it makes it very hard for our Girrigan Rangers to work on country when you're dealing across so many different land tenures. A perfect example that I talked to Rachel about was, I was sitting down with Chris Morita. He's our head ranger coordinator there at Girrigan. He's my nephew. We're all related at Girrigan, one big family. And he said, Arnie, he said, we can go up to the Cape York area up here and work and see other rangers in practice with their on country. And one of the things is fire management. Up there, they can just drop a match anytime they want. If they see country needs a burn, a cultural burn, they are allowed to just drop a match and take care of country the way, autonomously, the way that they should be doing it as passed down from their ancestors. Where we are in Cardwell and those surrounding areas, the amount of red tape you have to go through, the amount of government forms that you have to fill in, it's shocking. It's really, really shocking. And we're not talking about, clearing or burning the whole 1.2 million hectares. You do it in certain areas where country needs that, So, yeah, they have to deal with that all the time, and they just do not have complete autonomy to really work towards the aspirations of what their elders and their traditional owners would like to see them doing on country. It makes it very hard.
Could I quickly pick up on that, because that's a really interesting kind of issue. It's widely communicated across the scientific fields that IPAs are a form of, I guess, decolonial conservation, this sort of Indigenous-led conservation. So I guess I'm wondering, what's the difference between that sort of land tenure and the autonomy you have to be able to enact cultural practice and the the situation up in the Cape that you're talking about, where there is that capacity under Queensland legislation, and speaking to, is it truly a decolonial type of land management?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that come into play with that, because up there they're not in a built-up area. That it's Aboriginal freehold, it's national park, and basically the national parks have been handed back to traditional owners up there. It's a big difference down where in Cardwell and for us as Jitterbug people up in the Tully Gorge area. If we want to do a small cultural burn up there, oh my God, we've got to go through our native title body, get their permission, and then we've got to go back through the park. You've got to get permits. You've got to apply for all of this, and it takes time. Meanwhile, invasive weeds could be coming in there, feral pigs could be coming in there and completely destroying it, especially if it's a very culturally significant site, and it's special. It holds a special cultural, knowledge for our people. You can't just go in there and do it the way that we would have done it when our ancestors were still around.
And the other thing is the burning you got to have burn at the right time, and we find on our country that if we don't burn and the build up of vegetation and that, and then someone does go in there and drop a match in it, you get more of an intense burn, especially in the summertime, which propagates then a certain species, and then you get an over representation of a certain species, and the way I put it, it puts country out of balance, if that makes any sense. And then you got the invasive weeds that sometimes are really effectively controlled by burning. So on the station there, when we first got it back 25 years ago, we sent the fire brigade into a frenzy because we just didn't care. We just dropped. We seen country needed burning, we did it. And they've grown. The last time I rang up for a permit, because we have international students coming and we're teaching them how to cool burn. And, I'll ring up to the fireys and say, we need a permit. And they'll go, you fellas know what you're doing, just go ahead, So we got them on board. But the thing is that it's taken time to do that. And once they know that we know what we're doing and there's no risk to people or property, it's just a way of, I think we've got to start asserting our rights to country and how we manage it.
Maybe to follow from that, both of you collaborate with scientists in your work, not necessarily Indigenous scientists all the time. I'm interested in this question of how your collaborations assert your interest in protecting country and restoring country in particular ways. Jacob's property, for the people that don't know, half of it is a cattle farm inherited as that, and he's destocked the other half of the farm to basically bring back the wetlands in that area, which flow between the rainforest and the Great Barrier Reef. Which is a very uneconomical thing to do in the beginning, but you're also one of the few Indigenous, the only Indigenous blue carbon project currently getting funding to restore those wetlands in the future. And Sonya is working increasingly with non-Indigenous scientists on all of the dingo organising that you're doing, and I think this would be an interesting way to bring forward this conversation about the Indigenous science insurgencies. Yeah.
I love science, absolutely love it, because it just backs up what we need to be doing, and it with us, I think we're looking back maybe 12 years ago now. We did everything to try and get our country, our wetlands functioning again. There's significant wetlands. Everything that's west of us flows into the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Lagoon through our wetlands. So we tried everything from aerial spraying. We don't like to use glyphosate on sensitive areas, but apparently there's a frog-friendly one. So we used to do aerial spray and then cultural burning, and it'd work for a certain time. But the aggressiveness of the olive hybenacne, it just outcompetes any native species. The seeds stay in the ground for up to 7 years. We're never going to get rid of it. And it's just so aggressive. And 1 year, if you miss 1 year, it's back just as prevalent as it was before. So we've come to the thing where if it's in water, we want to get rid of it. If it's on land, let the cattle graze it. But the successful thing that we did was we actually, when they first brought olive hybenacne into that country, they had to put in bun walls and that to stop the saline water coming in. We got a grant and we collaborated with CSIRO and did some planning and did some modelling, and we removed that saltwater, that bun wall that was put in there probably 70-something years ago, maybe 100 years, I can't remember. But the results were amazing. As the saline water came back into that wetland, it just completely restored the wetland. Before we removed the bun wall, we did the electrical fishing. I don't know if anyone's heard of that, where they actually electrocute the water and they can tell what species are there, fish and that. Even small crocodiles come floating up. But that gives the scientists the capacity to see what's there. And before we removed that bun wall, there was not one native species. The only thing they found was tilapia. So we removed that bun wall, the saline water came back in. We did it in time for the highest annual tides, and the water came back in. 1 year we just restored that whole wetland. It was amazing. They did the electrical fishing again, found barramundi, there was mangrove jack, there was even mud crabs in there. So it was amazing to see how quickly the country can heal itself. And, we talk about, I don't know how to explain it, but, you feel country. You feel country. And it gives me, I'm really passionate about taking young people down there. We've got schools coming from America, from Melbourne, all over the country comes to our place and they do the tours. And when you're taking kids down there and, one of the things I try to do is when that kid leaves our tour, they have some concept of an environmental conscience that they'll think, because you never know, one of those kids could be our next environment minister or prime minister or whoever, but you want every kid to go away with having some idea about preserving our planet. But the problem with our wetlands is that we've had lots and lots of fresh water come in, and the seeds of the hybenacne stay in the ground, as I said, for 7 years, and it's all back there again. It's clogged up again. So the opportunity now for us is that we're one of the first pre-approved groups in the country, the only Indigenous one, for a blue carbon project. And they tell me that a blue carbon project will is more beneficial, even more than what the rainforest can produce. So we're excited about that. We're trying to get that project registered, and look, and as I said, we won awards for that environmental project. And again, I always say that we come from a farming community in Ingham. The guys up there, the cane farmers, they'll grow cane in their bedroom if they could. But it's about changing their attitudes too, and I've seen, they argue about climate change, and this is why I love science. Science backs up everything, backs up our argument, and it's about changing that. And I've seen in my lifetime, I've seen the differences in my country. The fish, the species, you don't see them no more. The butterflies, you don't see them anymore. We're talking about the native bees and things, you just don't see them anymore. So things are changing, and it's not for the better. It's not for the better. So my message is like we as all Australians need to unite and get our country enshrined in law that protects what's left of it. And that's my message.
We had a great conversation about dingoes in the making of this film, and it was just such an important conversation that the whole thing fell out because it would have been a film on its own. And also because Sonya is making her own dingo films. And for those who don't know, there was a really major sovereign forum organised by Girigan, driven very much by Sonya and her collaborators around the dingo around the same time as the Voice referendum. And it was such an amazing vibe in that room to see how powerful that organisation was. I wondered if you could say something about how that dingo work relates to some of these legal property issues that we were talking about.
Yeah, so it was a great event, and really when we started organising it, we didn't know, the response we would get, because this had never been done before. It was the first ever in Australia where we talked about the dingo from an Indigenous perspective. And we just kept getting phone calls at the office from mob all around Australia wanting to come to have their say. Because I don't know whether everybody knows, but since the first fleet arrived in this country, they brought their cattle and sheep with them, and they decimated dingoes from day dot right up till now. And over 200 years, in my investigations looking further into this, not once has traditional owners been consulted about this culturally significant animal. And when you do the research, and this is white scientists saying that the two most important stories, creation stories for Indigenous Australians across the country, and when I say that, I say a majority of them that I've looked into, is the rainbow serpent and the dingo songlines that connect us all, because they're very strong. The two strongest animals that have a very strong place in Aboriginal society. So I started to look in my own backyard here in Queensland, and Queensland's pretty bad when it comes to the protection of and the destruction of dingoes in this country. I think the biggest issue, that I think impacts even more so on dingoes, is this term called wild dog, because it's been an accepted thing since colonisation that dingoes are readily mating with domestic dogs, and that has been completely debunked with the current science by Dr Coen Hird at the University of New South Wales using DNA testing, and she uses the same method that is used for human DNA testing. So she uses, back then, scientists that were using old, out-of-date DNA testing, I think it was only like 130 markers or 90 markers or something like that. This DNA testing that Dr. Kylie Cairns uses is 195,000 markers. So it's foolproof. And so she did about 5,000 tests from dingo carcasses from all around Australia. And basically, 98% of those dingoes all came back pure. So it really debunked that statement that dingoes were readily mating with domestic dogs, and that they were actually, not pure, they were dingo hybrids. And it's really sad, because still to date, government departments are not taking that seriously, the current science. And so that's why I'm out there advocating, but I strongly advocate the Aboriginal voice, because our voice has been left out of this decision, and it's been left out over many different topics. We're the last to know. And when I started to do my research for the two legislations here in Queensland, so the Biosecurity Act of 2014 here in Queensland classifies dingoes in 3, 4, 5, 6 and 8. They're the categories. It's a restricted invasive species, and that landholders have a obligation to do away with dingoes because they're considered a biosecurity threat to the livestock industry. And that's fair enough, I understand that. But then you've got the Nature Conservation Act of 1994 that says dingoes are protected in national parks and are culturally important. Well, actually, it doesn't even state that. So anyway, I looked even further into this. So I had a lawyer company from Brisbane here reach out to me because they were so interested in what I was doing with dingoes and the First Nations voice for them. They said, we want to offer you some pro bono support. What do you want to do? So I had a hookup with them and I said, I want to understand the Queensland legislations because I said, that's my fight. That's where I'm going. Because I want to litigate the Queensland government. And she said, all right. So we started looking into both legislations. And through these lawyers, they did find the gaps, but we didn't write them in the Environmental Planning Journal because that's our ammunition to go to town with them. But what that found was that the legislation is like that all across Australia. So, New South Wales is similar, the ACT is similar, Victoria is disgusting, WA is the same. And it's really funny, in the Northern Territory they're protected, but farmers still have a right to shoot them or destroy them if they impact on their property. Anyway, that was fine. We found that you can find that paper too. I'll get the information and give that to Rachel so she can share it out to anybody that's interested in finding out what was written about that. Since 2021, when I found out that we didn't have a say in this culturally significant animal. And why is it culturally significant? Well, we have a dingo creation story in the Jedabal people, and our dingo creation story, the black and tan dingo in that story is my cousin. He's the black and tan dingo in our story, and his little brother is the gold dingo. So they're very culturally important to me, and they're through our kinship system. So, if I'm out on country and I see a gold dingo, I automatically think that that's Anthony. And we lost Anthony. He was a great up-and-coming footballer. We lost him about 20 years ago. So for me, as a very spiritually connected person to a totem, or to the environment, to animals, even when I see a gold dingo out on country and I see it stop and look at me, straight away that tells me there's a connection there that could be Anthony, So very important to me spiritually and culturally. And I work a lot with Robert, who is the black and tan dingo in our story. But in 2021, I founded Dingo Culture, which is a platform that provides the Indigenous perspective on dingoes, and it's been slowly growing. About 3 months after that, somebody shared me a post of a new group that was, and I was really keen to get into this group, and it was Landholders for Dingoes. And so I sent a private message, and back came this message from a Dr. Barry Trail. And our friendship has grown since then. He is one of Australia's most important ecologists, but his focus is dingoes, and he's currently a strong political climate change campaigner. And we had a really good conversation, and he said to me, you know, Sonya, he said, I'm so glad we got to meet. He said, because the ducks are aligning for the dingo. He said, we have landholders, which are cattle graziers, that are coexisting with dingoes because they get better economic returns when they leave the dingoes alone in their family structure. We have the conservation there. We have the science there. But he said the one thing that we don't have is the Aboriginal people and the Aboriginal voice. He said once we have that, we can really start powering along to hopefully afford this animal protections across the country. So I've worked with Dr. Barry for the last 6 years alongside him, and then another lady came along into my life, and that was Alex Livingston from the Defend the Wild. And so Alex and myself for the last 5 years have really been powering along with our advocacy work for the dingo. She really strongly supports me with Indigenous people. I've spoken to many Indigenous people, and this is what's been said to me by Indigenous mob out there when I've talked to them about the dingo. They said they had no idea that the dingo was not protected, and they're absolutely shocked as to how this animal is being treated. And then they start to elaborate with me how important this animal is to them, you know. So it's not just me, you know. This is a collective, and this is a movement now that is really starting to fire up, and there's more to come. I'm not finished. But, you know, I'm hoping that, you know, within the next 5 to 10 years we'll see real significant change with legislation as we continue to work with those wonderful scientists. You know, with having Dr. Kylie at the forefront of this and still powering on in her science allows us and enables us to advocate and fight the system. You know, and it's so good when you see Indigenous knowledge combined with scientific knowledge. The two work well, you know, and I think moving forward with environmental impacts and you know, what's happening to the natural environment here in Australia, I think when you bring those two recipes together, I don't think you can go wrong. I think you can only create greater benefits for you know, not just us, but for the wider community, because people, yes, the dingoes are culturally significant to us, but people don't realise the ecological benefits of dingoes either. You know, you all know about Yellowstone and what the wolves did with Yellowstone National Park. Dingoes are no different. That's exactly what's happening. And there's a new paper that's going to be coming out very soon, Woolleen Station up in the Pilbara region, and that's David Pollock. He's a cattle grazier up there. He runs cattle up there. When he bought that property, it was absolutely just, you know, it was desertification. It was just totally wrecked from cattle and sheep. Anything with a hoof had just completely destroyed the country. He bought it, and because he lives and coexists with dingoes with his cattle, there'll be a video coming out very shortly that will show the significance, just like what's happened at Yellowstone and what this one property has done just by leaving an apex predator in the natural environment. Because if you take out the apex predator, you wreck what they call the trophic cascade. Every environment, every natural environment needs an apex predator. It keeps balance. They stop overpopulation of herbivores like kangaroos and wallabies, and you'll find that a lot of these graziers, landholders for dingoes, have cattle, and the reason why they have the dingoes there is because the dingoes take out the kangaroo implosion and eating their grasses for their cattle. So there's a balance there all the time. But not only that, dingoes take out mesopredators like foxes and feral cats, which are, you know, then have a benefit to the smaller native animals to thrive, and even endangered species. You see Indigenous rangers working with the ground parrots, the night parrot. There's a dingo. The reason why the night parrot survived because there's been an apex predator there, and so the foxes and feral cats don't go in. They've done poo testing, and in the poo, their scatters, all they've been eating, the dingo's just been doing its natural diet, and feral cats have been in there in its poo. So there's a lot out there that has been totally misleading about this animal, and I'm at the forefront trying to help debunk that with my scientific friends and my dingo advocacy friends and the organisations that I work with, but most importantly making sure that First Nations people have a seat at the table and are there at the decision making on this animal. And number one is to change the legislation to include us so that we have a legislative right to say how this dingo needs to be managed.
Coen deals with the other side of this interface, and we've had some really amazing discussions on what it means to be teaching inside an environment science department, in these conditions with the next generation of people who are dealing with these legacy institutions that aren't actually, even representative necessarily of the best scientific practices, right? So I just wondered if you would like to respond from that perspective.
Yeah, I reckon I could just sit here and listen to Sonya talk about dingoes for days on end, eh? I'm thinking of a dingo documentary, Sonya's narrating.
That's coming.
It's real relevant, and it's been good to meet Sonya. I actually been following a bit of that work and seen it culminated in a First Nations dingo declaration, and so I use that as a pedagogical tool in a lot of my teaching. So teaching environmental science students, a lot of the scientific work that people get trained in the natural sciences does operate in disciplinary silos a lot of the time. So there's not a lot of engagement with things like Indigenous rights. It is, slowly shifting and changing, but in my context, say for one of the courses that I teach into, Bachelor of Wildlife Science, it'll be the first time that any of these students who are in their final year at university have had any exposure to any kind of thing like this. So they're often used to thinking about environmental science, conservation through this, a dominant lens that's about protecting the wild, protecting these natural wilderness places. And so we kind of come in and shake that up a little bit and start to challenge ideas of wilderness as pristine areas that are absent of humans, and these kinds of things. And we're really aiming for, I guess, transformation of thinking, because we do see, and like you are saying, mob and scientists often do have overlapping interests and priorities around protecting country. Even reflecting on this film, it's really part of this kind of time of a birth of conservation in Australia. There were there wasn't really a marine science back then, even though we're still working on getting freshwater science up at that same level. But yeah, I think part of my reflection there is I think it is important in policy and in, I guess, the consciousness of scientists to start to, I guess, connect their disciplines back into the wider picture. I think part of what a lot of mob in environmental science have been working towards is exactly that. I know the National Environmental Science Program has a lot of deadly blackfellas in there who are putting the sort of torch to the policy and starting to recognise, I guess, culturally significant entities. Yeah, because a lot of what we're focusing on around conservation in Australia is threatened species and how we define what's threatened, what's rare, And just because something's, common in one place and across Australia more broadly doesn't mean it's common in others. And in places where it isn't, it might be a sacred species for a mob, it might be totemic. So there's this real kind of, mismatch between how we think about the natural world in conservation and in science, where we often study it through disembodied, detached, objective lens, but as Indigenous people, we embody much different relationships with the natural world, relationships that are actually important for capturing the hearts of communities to even engage in conservation in the first place. But that's some of my thoughts. Yeah.
We're going to have a cup of tea and continue this conversation. There will be a chance for questions, and we're going to be connecting this up also to more climate-y conversations after the break, and legal questions, if anyone has any legal questions. Well, Coen said before we broke that it might be interesting to think about the current state of play in environment law and restoration practices that's affecting these local places. So that might be an interesting way to start. And also Coen and I talked about the fact that the State of the Environment report now has Indigenous collaborations on all articles except for Antarctica. I think, if we could maybe zoom out a bit in order to come back in with some of this kind of policy reform conversation.
Yeah. Well, I could maybe pick up on the first bit in particular, because I think there was a lot of what you were saying in particular, Jacob, that really spoke to me. I do a lot of work around permitting for restoration and the different sorts of legal hurdles that you need to cross to be able to do restoration. And, we've got this legal system that, and I think, you talked a bit about it in terms of the wilderness ethic and everything, that's really enmeshed in this idea of trying to preserve the status quo. And I mean, it's something that obviously can be challenged. If you want to build a mine, we're pretty okay with interfering with the status quo, but restoration is treated as this interference with the way things are, even though you might be talking about country that's incredibly degraded and in need of that intervention and that working with it to be able to bring it back. But the law views that in exactly the same way that it views any other interference with the environment and with country. So, I mean, it's a real barrier, and one that.
And this is the thing that really eats at me, like that country there where you see now.
Yeah.
It's just clogged with invasive species.
Yeah.
It's open now because there's been a flood there.
Yeah.
But I'd like to get honestly, I'd just like to get an excavator in there and scoop out the weeds. But you've got to go through all these permits and that.
Yeah.
But did they ask for any permits to bring these invasive species into my country?
Yeah.
Did they ask to clear the land and fill in creeks and did they get their permits to do that? No. Why have we got to do all go through all these hurdles? I mean, it's just and I just heard a wonderful testimony before. It just really made my day, and I just because I take people down to our wetlands and get them to try and connect with country, not in a physical way, but in a spiritual way, and not just getting people just to close their eyes for a minute and see what they feel, and just heard an amazing testimony before that someone's just come up and shared with me, but. And even when when we got our country back, the Indigenous Land Corporation said to us, would you like just certain parts of Mangala back? And my auntie said, no. When white men come here, they didn't ask if they could have this country. And they took the whole lot.
Yeah.
We want it all back, And so this is where I think we need to explore ways that we can push through these barriers and push through these laws, because at the end of the day, the country needs work now. The country needs to be healed now. And these legalities and these restrictions, they just really, they choke us up.
Yeah.
So, be interesting to have a yarn to you.
Yeah, it is extraordinary. I did some work with some of my colleagues a few years ago where we spoke to a number of people doing restoration just to capture their stories more than anything about experiences with the permitting process. And the really interesting and the really scary thing that came out of it is quite a few people told us a story that was, we wanted to do this really ambitious work, but we had to scale it back because of the legal processes. That might have been scaling back in terms of the footprint of how big the site was they wanted to restore, or where they wanted to restore. When you're choosing where to restore, there's all sorts of reasons why you want to restore the country you restore, right? But if the permitting's too hard there, maybe we'll just have to go here and restore somewhere that's not as important. So, these legalities that we have are not just stopping people from doing things, it's forcing them to make decisions to do things in ways that aren't, what they need.
Sometimes it's easy to say, I'm sorry, rather than can I. Right, just go and do it and then say, oh, sorry.
Well, I like Megan Cope's philosophy there with the oyster poles. But it does raise that thing, of that there's that tension between, having to follow colonial law in conservation and then having your own cultural law that you are obligated to. It speaks to your yarn, Sonya, about, dropping the fire there. Like that's part of a custodial ethic, a law of obligation, and it's interesting to think about how environmental law is trying to grapple, I guess, with some of the, its own sort of legal fiction or its premise in colonisation.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you really touched on that before when you were talking about how you teach this idea of the wilderness ethic. And I'd love to come and sit in one of your courses, actually, because it's just such a fascinating concept to me, this idea that, land and country is this thing that we need to just lock up and leave completely devoid of human interference. And it really is something that permeates a lot of our Western legal systems here and how we manage protected areas. Like getting permits to do restoration in protected areas is even harder than elsewhere because there's this real logic that permeates it, that's over there and humans are over here, and these aren't to cross, which is just so completely at odds with the country and how you interact.
I think, like for Jacob and myself and for any other mob here in the audience, like at the end of the day, we're all proud Australians, but we are Indigenous and we have a legacy to carry on. We walk two worlds. Mm. We walk the Western world and we walk our traditional world. And LORE is so important to us. That's how I've been raised by my father and what he's taught me and what my elders have taught me. And so sometimes you have to cross the line because it does not respect who I am and where I come from as a Jitterbug person. And that's my reasoning with my dingo advocacy is that, yes, I respect your LAW, but when it crosses over and tells me that I do not have the right to conduct LORE according to this animal, then I'm sorry, you got a fight on your hand because it's who I am. And you're taking my identity away from me.
Yeah, it's a really powerful way to look at it. And I think it's so important that should be centred in moving forward with this. I think there's a lot of conversation at the moment about how we reform permitting and how we find a way that we can move forward with restoration. And I think that's just so critical that your voices should be at the very centre of that. Yeah, and the work you're doing, Jacob, I think is just... anybody in the restoration space in Australia just holds up Mungala Station as such a gold standard of things that are going on. And it's amazing, the work that you're doing, really amazing. Mm.
I'll be happy when it's all done.
We were chatting yesterday about how you actually interrupt these environment science education platforms. That's also a question for interrupting law school, which is also maybe an even more conservative space, perhaps. Coen, I was wondering if you could say more about that, like how you actually approach, the difference between what you might say you're going to do and what you actually actively do in the classroom, perhaps?
That's a hard one. Yeah, I guess I'm pretty honest with students, about what I'm going to say in the classroom. You have to come at it from a certain. Well, I believe you have to come at it from a certain way, which is understanding that you're people aren't where you're at. For a lot of students, especially students coming from certain parts of the country or have been raised in certain ways of thinking, it can be a real challenge for a lot of them students. So I don't tell people how it is. I say, here's what someone said. Here, I expose them to narratives, to stories that they haven't heard before, and it's really, it's giving them the tools to make that growth. Like you can't expect people to go from here to here, but it's just complicating the mix. I think it's different when you're interfacing with institutions. That's when you do have to start being more careful, or not dishonest, but using different language. And part of it, I think, is like there's a power imbalance. If you start to sound too I struggle with this because I think of all the grassroots mob in my family who'd just be like, tell them how it is, and you're like, well, you can do that, but then you won't be in that space for very long. And so, I'm kind of, I pick my times to speak up, and be kind of real staunch. And then other times it's like you're playing that respectability politics, speaking, if you want to be pragmatic. And I really hate the term. I struggle with it. There's a tension with it, pragmatism. Like you're trying to make change. If you don't, nothing changes. It's true, but at the same time, if you're constantly speaking the language of the institution, you worry that you sort of become that. You sort of start to think like that, and it's a real kind of problem I have with interfacing with, the language of environmental law or of government. Even the idea of using like markets to advance Aboriginal community interests, blue carbon, for example. Well, these are systems that have been developed by capitalistic colonial societies, and they use logics of extraction, commodification, commercialisation. We're strategically entangled within these systems because we, have to use them to give some benefit back to community. But yeah, there's a tension in there, isn't there? Especially as mob, where we're like having to learn this language of economics to talk about our kin, and we put a dollar value on our ancestors and our culture. So it's a weird thing. I don't know if I've kind of zigzagged off the path of the question, probably, but yeah.
No, that's good. Yeah, I mean, I guess for people that haven't seen the film, Jake has been doing restoration work for 16 years or something on that property, and the blue carbon funding is just this next piece of funding that is going to be used to be basically achieving what he's already been doing anyway. But I'm sure that you're the only blue carbon project that's, running a school. Can you say something about how you think about your community work in terms of using these pools of money to do what you already wanted to be doing anyway?
Yeah, and it's, we really struggle financially. It's a small it's only 2,000 acres. So before we got it back, 3/4 of the country was sold off. And when we first got the country back, the elders then identified 4 things right back then in that early first property management plan. And that was, it's obviously a cattle property, which is going to give us income. But they were very adamant about having training and education opportunities for our mob. And the other thing was tourism and land, looking after the country. So those are the 4 pillars: tourism, cattle, land management, and training and education. And we collaborated with the Silver Lining Foundation, and we started our first school off in a little rundown shed that we still use to feed all the tourists and everything. And I call it a very religious shed because there's a lot of holes in the roof. It's very holy, you know. And we started with 6 students, and I think it was about 5 years ago. We've graduated over 50 young people, and now we've got a campus off-site. It's residential as well, and the whole idea is that we're going to, you know, we've got to, and we're still in the process of, trying to educate these young people. They just don't do it in 4 walls anymore. It's more hands-on and stuff that they're going to apply to their lives. So we're looking down the track of conservation, ecosystem management, and getting kids focused on country. And they can use numeracy and literacy skills in looking after country. They've got to, you know, map out country that's affected by weeds, or, you know, we've got a lot of feral pigs and feral cats and everything on our property. So they could be doing pig trapping, measuring and making traps. I don't know, but that's the kind of things that we want kids to learn and get practical skills in. But yeah, using different types of funding also helps us to employ our people to engage on country. And we see the Blue Carbon project as, and again, there's so many hurdles that we have to apply, and even with the Blue Carbon, you know, we found out that sometimes the so-called partners are really not there for our interests, they're in there for their own interests. And, you know, our Blue Carbon project was, you know, it wasn't even in our name, it was in the name of the other body. And I said, no. We want the better. We're tired of getting scraps off the table, and, you know, your organisation is not going to be looking after our kids and making sure that there's those pathways into employment, and it's about, you know, we've got huge problems in our community, huge problems. But I see land management as a way of connecting people back to country, and that's self-empowerment. It really is. It really gives people a sense of identity and who they are, and in economic opportunities that can provide training and employment. I'm 100% for, you know. So yeah, and the tourism as well. You know, you know, as I said yesterday, the country does most of the tour for you, and we're combining the land management stuff with the tourism stuff. So we take people down to the wetlands, explain what we do there, and yeah, look, it's a long journey, and but even like with and other opportunities come out just from that small property and the work that we've been doing in restoring wetlands and waterways. It brings in other partners like BirdLife Australia. We now got more documented bird life on that little property than Cassady National Park. That's unbelievable, the bird life, you know, that's coming back through. And it's not only, it's being innovative too. We restored one wetland through removal of bun walls, mechanically removing them, allowing saline water to come back. What they found, and this is why I love science, because on other wetlands where it was just not impossible, but it was going to cost too much money to do the same thing, to introduce saline water back onto those wetlands, they discovered that underneath the ground were these saltwater aquifers that had the same salinity as the ocean. So they put in these saltwater bores and they solar pumped the water onto this wetland, completely restored the wetland. It was just amazing to go and sit back down on that country and see all the native lilies come back. And just as the breeze blew across the wetland, you could smell that beautiful perfume. And the bird life that come back, you know, and I didn't realise at the time, but bird watchers are crazy. they seen a thing. They seen he was so excited. He seen a painted snipe. I don't know what the hell a painted snipe is. I never. The ones I look at is the magpie geese because they're good eating. But there's this a painted snipe, and I made the mistake of telling someone in Townsville, a bird watcher that I knew. That next Saturday morning, there was like 30 cars there parked up on the property, all looking for painted snipe. But and I had a great opportunity to have get to know what's his name, Bruce Pascoe, and him and his wife came out, and they were just amazed at the wetlands and the bird life that they seen there, you know. And we've got an amazing relationship with BirdLife Australia, and we're actually heading over to Perth for the conference in next month, I think, to talk about the Mungalla wetlands. And the other opportunity too is when we first did that project back in 2012 of restoring that wetland, CSIRO put all the water loggers in. So they've been recording salinity, depth, temperature, all this information since 2012. So now we've got all this information that they're finding is relevant for mapping out climate change. And but again, I come up with the thing, well, if you're using that information and it's creating benefit, who gets that benefit? So they're all the little hurdles, I guess, that you find out along the way. Yeah.
One thing we were talking about was this concept of like top-down conservation planning, where these goals get more ambitious, but the Indigenous representation is questionable in the building of ambition. In 2022, the UN set a goal for states to conserve at least 30% of land and water by 2030. You were telling me how in practice that can sometimes take place a little bit cynically, and also, you know, how much these new concepts of conservation are still trying to think about themselves as so innovative that they don't actually represent repetitive, reproductive Indigenous cultural practices. I think both of you will, well, everyone will probably have something to say about that, but I was wondering about what the current state of that change is in law.
Yeah, I mean, the target you're talking about is the Global Biodiversity Framework that was signed the end of 2022. I work a little bit with the protection and restoration targets there, and they're completely unachievable, completely unachievable. There's this fascinating question about why countries would ever sign up to something that they've got no hope of reaching. I think in some ways it almost takes the pressure off, right? You've got this goal that's so unattainable, you can just kind of sit back because nobody actually expects you to reach it. But you know, when we talk about signing something in 2022 to have this hugely ambitious thing done by 2030, that's not a very long time, and it certainly doesn't lend itself rather to things being done in a thoughtful way, right? It leads to things being done in a very ad hoc, opportunistic way, and that's absolutely not what we need. It's absolutely not something that's going to ensure that your voices are centered in these sorts of discussions. It's going to lead to things just happening, you know, where they can happen. So yeah, I mean, global goals they've been touted as incredibly important, but I'm pretty cynical about them for a whole lot of reasons. But I think, you know, particularly in the conversation that we're having, I think, yeah, it doesn't lend itself to the kind of thoughtful approach that we really need to have. So I'd be keen to hear your views though, Coen.
Yeah, well, I think my views are a bit more just based in personal cynicism than evidence-based. But yeah, I agree. And like I look at the last State of the Environment report, they came out looking at some of these global targets and national targets for conservation. And something that stands out to me is kind of seeing that the percentage of some of our even national conservation targets that can be met just by Aboriginal lands alone. And it's a stark kind of thing to realise that actually if enough, you know, resources were actually put into the hands of Aboriginal people to manage their own lands, obviously the whole continent's Aboriginal land, but you know, even within the sort of Western colonial structures, then we probably almost achieved most of our targets anyway. So it always just makes me think about why is this not resourced? You know, like why do we construct IPAs with so few positions for Aboriginal rangers, for conservation? You know, like why can't our mob afford to do any of the things they need to do to look after country?
And IPAs make up, 50% of our entire national reserve system. So if, all the protected areas in Australia, half of that is IPAs. So it's Aboriginal people that are expected to do this heavy lifting, this incredibly heavy lifting that we're relying on as a nation to get towards these international targets rather. So yeah, I mean, you're spot on. I guess that really ties back to this tension that you were talking about with the carbon market and how it's not at all an easy fit to sort of engage with this commodification of nature. But it's, I mean, I guess in some ways it's a way to get that funding in to be able to do that management of country. So it's such a tension.
Yeah, like when the government would give you bugger all money to look after your land, like I wouldn't begrudge anyone who has to seek any alternative ways of doing that job. It's like, it's part of obligation and law, like looking after the land. I mean, the government grants that I get for my research, it's blood money at the end of the day. So, fair enough where you get it. But you do, I always wonder, like, well, who's buying these carbon credits too? Because it is a lot of the extractive industries offsetting their emissions. And so it's a funny ecosystem that we live in Australia. But, I think there's a way that we can point out the contradictions and be clear-eyed about it and still be pragmatic and make sure that we do what we have to do to keep country healthy.
Maybe that's a moment to open up to any questions from the audience for any of the panelists, if you have any questions.
I got a question for the audience. I'm looking and seeing some deadly scientists in the audience over here who work in the carbon sort of markets, and I was wondering what do you have any, I guess, thoughts or experiences working with mob in the carbon space, or like where do you see things heading in the future? Like what needs to change?
It's a great question, Coen. The answer is yes, we have some experiences. I'm with the Lovelock lab that's lucky enough to work a bit with Girigan and also a bit at Mangala, although not me personally. And at the moment, our lab is working on another carbon method looking at controlling the impacts of feral ungulates, so things with hard hooves, camels, buffalo, cattle, deer, donkeys, goats, the list goes on, in wetlands.
Pigs. How could you forget pigs?
Oh, and pigs, of course. How could I forget pigs? Yes. Because they tear up wetlands, and by removing them, you do have positive effects on what the carbon market is interested in. But more critically, you have positive effects on special places and on biodiversity and on special animals. And yet, oftentimes in the work I do, I really feel like I'm working for fossil fuel companies just with a few layers of separation, exactly as you were saying, Coen. And I think usually with the groups that we work with, which have been in Kakadu and in the far North Kimberleys and on the Cape, there's really very minimal interest in carbon, in the fact that doing these kinds of actions on country will result in more carbon storage or less carbon going into the atmosphere, but more that carbon is a means to an end for getting money for jobs on country and for work that keeps country healthy. But yes, certainly I sit every day with that tension that the same industries that are still polluting are the ones that now we are working hard to prove that what we already know is good for country is, quote, rigorous enough for the government to certify a credit that then these companies can buy to offset their emissions, and then some funds flow back to folks working on country. So it's a tricky space, and I guess I get to sleep at night by thinking about pragmatism.
I think for me, I think I see, the relationship between people working in art spaces or producing art practices, engage with communities, and people that are contesting the legal system, through whatever issue that they're dealing with, sometimes the question is actually just what can we actually get away with here? And I think if you start from that in a kind of general way, there always is some way to redistribute something, right? And I think that is some kind of continuity, I think, as well. I wondered if anyone had thoughts on this is a bit of a left field link, but a lot of the things I think about when we're having conversations like this in museums is about this relationship between legal education, political education, science communication, and the kind of improvisation that comes from artists and from art spaces. And I think those spaces are getting squeezed together a bit more once we realise that we all need to think in a more improvised way about what we're actually trying to do with the institutions that we inhabit. If anyone has any comments on that.
I don't want to. Anyone else have anything to add? I can comment just yarning on. Yeah, I guess I'm a bit of a twitcher. I'm sorry, bird lover. But back on the birds. So, yeah, a bit offended, Jacob, but no. He's right. It's a weird bunch. Yeah, but I'm part of a group of mob Indigenous peoples globally connected by migratory birds through our cultural stories. Something that I find beautiful in that is that we all come from very different positions. I have a very Western science training. I'm not much of an artist, but our collective is full of artists, full of very politically savvy people, full of legal scholars from all over the world. And like when we're able to work on a sort of an issue together, something around climate change on birds, like we're united over this love for the birds and for our for the depth of our cultures that we can connect to each other through. But we're able, we were yarning a bit about this before, in a way. I was talking with you about it, Jackie. Like, it's able to capture the hearts of our communities in a way. We can bring it to our communities, and they're all invested in it in a way that they never would have been if they were just engaging with it through one of those lenses, through law, through science, maybe even through art. But kind of just being able to speak to a part of every part, I guess it's that more holistic approach. It leads to better outcomes, because I know that conservation science is rooted in love, in the sense that a lot of the people who go in and study animals love animals, and then they learn about them through ways that they never thought they would, where they're told you can't love it, you have to be detached from it. But I know that conservation science has failed, the animals that we love, in a lot of ways, because it hasn't captured the hearts of the communities that are, doing the work on the ground to care for them. Yeah, there's more to do in that space of bringing together. I know I don't love the interdisciplinarity of, I think some disciplines are quite, have harmful, but moving beyond the disciplinary, I suppose, I think there's room for that.
It's really lovely, and I think I come from a discipline that is harmful, and it's certainly not one that attracts people because of love. It's one that attracts people because of money, I think. And we've got these incredibly wicked problems that we're dealing with. How to move forward in a way that you can engage and manage with your country, and law's not going to answer that on its own. I think it's so important to be engaging with art, with conservation, with other sorts of disciplines, and law's not going to fix this problem. Law created this problem. So yeah, absolutely. Collaboration.
There's a question at the back there.
No, I didn't have a question.
this might not be a question, but I think it's just an opportunity maybe to share a thought that I've been having a lot. I'm from QUT, and I teach climate injustice in local and social and global worlds, and they're social workers. And what I've learned more and more and more through this work, through work with Girigan, the wonderful visits to Mangala Station, etc., I'm trying to get my students to think, we talk about injustice in two ways usually, that those who contribute the least suffer the most, right? There's no denying. But I've been trying to say to students, don't get stuck in this victim of those. Actually, there's three things there. One is contribute the least, suffer the most, but give the most to everybody. And when we think about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and who is actually leading on climate in our country, we see again and again every dimension of it, whether it's stopping fossil fuel developments everywhere around the world, who's at the forefront, and who's at the forefront of caring for country and giving back to country more than anybody else. So I guess this is just an opportunity just to say a huge thank you. I try to instill gratitude in students, and I think it makes them feel really good, and it helps them to deal with anxiety, to be able to say thank you. So just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that I would reinforce that sentiment. If we don't have any more questions, I want to thank everyone here for coming so far to be with us today, for participating in the film. The film's going to travel around Australia and probably will go to other places. Sonya's going to Berlin if it goes to Berlin. But yeah, thank you so much to UQ for making all of this possible, the commission of the film, the hosting of the workshop in North Queensland. It's been super interesting to make those regional connections, and I think more and more, collaboration also needs to happen between urban and regional spaces so that we all know what's going on and who's on the front lines of what. And I'm really grateful that you had time to come and talk to us about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah.